No, it's good to be with you once again. So we're making our way through the 12 Ordinary Men series. Now we took a 2-week reprieve. We only have a couple of weeks to go. I was mentioning a moment ago before we started the service kind of my vision of where I'm wanting to go with the afternoon service, since this is primarily church members we're talking to. And so I want to take advantage of the opportunity, I should say. If we're going to have this time together in the afternoon, we might as well start diving deeper in the Bible and preach through. I'm most likely going to start with the Gospel of Mark, but I'm going to start preaching through some of the books of the Bible and really get to dive in deeper than, even in a Bible study, you're limited in how deep you can dive because you get questions and you go down avenues and it's sometimes hard to get back. I'm not pointing any fingers, but I'm excited for that. That's going to be, I'm hoping, very informative to get to do that deeper and study into the Gospels, into Jesus Christ Himself, His life, His ministry. So Lord willing, that's where we're headed, but we have 2 lessons left in 12 Ordinary Men. So this afternoon is going to be all about passion. Now, to be fair, all of the apostles had some level of their own passion for many different things. They had a passion to spread the Lord's message. Passion is something we understand. I think every one of us could tell you something in life you're passionate about. You're passionate about your families. You're passionate about your sports team. You're passionate about your job. You're passionate about so many things. But my hope in the example that we're going to look at before us this afternoon is you see how important it is to have that passion placed on the right thing. And of course, that's God at the top of that list. So given what we've seen so far, and looking at all these examples, most of us probably wouldn't have called many of the apostles that I've already called out for you. Some may. Now, the problem when you say, well, I would have, you know what we know now. You know what Jesus knew when He called them, but us looking at the surface of it probably wouldn't have called many of these apostles. But you imagine being handpicked by Jesus Christ, how amazing that would have to be. So something we've looked at already in depth, Luke chapter 6, verse 12 and following. Now it came to pass in those days that He went out to the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. So He's preparing. Then verse 13, and when it was day, He called His disciples to Himself, and from there He chose 12. Verse 14, Simon, whom He also named Peter, Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. So Jesus spends all night long in prayer. Jesus calls then these specific men to be His apostles. Very big event that unfolds. Now, something I haven't really talked about much in this study so far, but a question that does come up. And so I do want to take a moment to address this because you may find yourself dealing with this very question. If somebody comes up and asks you this question, are apostles still around today? How do you answer the question? Because most everybody when I ask the question, I saw their head shaking no. Why? Why aren't they still around today? Because you got people that'll wear the moniker. You just go to YouTube and search up Apostles 2023. And there's all kind of people that'll give themselves the name apostle. Not only will they give themselves apostle, they give themselves the name capital A apostle. Now, I know that can be confusing because, well, I'll give you the trick question. Are there apostles today? Sure there are. Lowercase a. We're all apostles. Apostles mean one sent. We're all lowercase a apostles. That's why you see people like James being called an apostle. He wasn't capital A apostle. He was one sent. My question is, are there office of the apostle, capital A, still around today? Because that's what they'll give themselves the title of. So, what were the requirements to be the office of the apostle? You had to have seen the resurrected Jesus Christ, be chosen by Jesus Christ, and have the signs and miracles that followed with that. If you couldn't do or couldn't say those 3 things, you were not an apostle. That's the problem with all those today that would carry that moniker. So no, the office of the apostle has closed. There are no more apostles, even though they give themselves the title. Now, when I look back through the list of ones we've talked about so far, we're not going to go back through the list, but a couple of them stick out as highly unlikely people. You have the foreknowledge of the Bible, so you're immediately going to say, Judas is the worst apostle, he's the one that doesn't make sense. You're going to go through the list of things that you have the knowledge and the ability to do because you have the Word. But what about the unlikely ones? I mean, fishermen, okay, they're at least hard workers. They at least put in the effort. Now, I was going to pick on Leon here, but I'm not going to because he said his back was hurting. Because I had a joke I was going to say about him going to fishing, always making Clifton clean them, but I'm not going to do it. It's been way too easy. But they're not afraid to get dirty. They're at least workers, and some of them, they have decent reputations. You can use that for ministry. Philip, Nathaniel, Thomas, okay, we kind of see what Jesus saw in them. But then you get to Matthew, and you're like, well, what in the world was Jesus thinking when he called Matthew? That makes no sense. Matthew is a tax collector. He's a betrayer of his people. He is a friend of Rome. So when Jesus calls Matthew, how many of the disciples do you think their jaws just hit the floor? In complete disbelief. What if I told you there's one more surprising than Matthew? A man that's going to be our focus today. And no, it's not Judas Iscariot. Arguably one of the most surprising ones is near the bottom of that list. Simon called the Zealot. And if Matthew is a surprising choice, the rebel terrorist named Simon is even more of a surprising choice. It'll make you scratch your head. It certainly does mine, until you learn and you get a glimpse of a little bit of what Jesus saw. So Simon is one of the apostles that we have essentially no information on. We don't know who his family was. We don't know where he's from. After the day of Pentecost, Simon is going to disappear from our text altogether. But you're going to see some things in a little bit that highlight a lasting faithfulness in this man. Now, I told you the focus of this lesson is going to be on passion. That's the greatest word you could use to describe Simon. Passion. Zealot meant zealous one, full of zeal, full of passion. So the zealots, I guess we are going to do a little bit deeper dive today. The zealots were one of the four groups that composed the Jews in the days of Jesus. And it surprised me how many people don't get into these kind of studies. I guess you have to be interested in it. But Josephus spends a good bit of time explaining the four groups that compose the Jews. I say Pharisees and Sadducees, you know who I'm talking about. If I say the Essenes and the Zealots, you're like, well, who in the world is that? Pharisees, you know, they're the Mosaic law vocalists. They're the ones that we're used to. They're the laws of men. Sadducees, they deny the supernatural. They deny the resurrection. We know those two, but then you get to the Essenes, which are not mentioned in the Bible. They are mentioned in history. They're part of the Jewish history. Josephus and Philo go into great detail about these, but they were the celibates. They lived in the desert. They devoted themselves to the study of the law. They are people that we would look at today like the monks. But then the last group, the Zealots, they are the rebels. This is where our new friend Simon is found. Simon, if you're not aware of this, Simon the Zealot is an extremist. They are politically minded. They hate the Roman government. They hate everything Rome with a severe passion. Their core belief was this, and you can read all about the Zealots in Jewish history. Their core belief is simple. Only God can rule over them and nobody else. So every time the Romans would enact a new law, every time the Romans would charge a new tax, the Zealots would revolt. The Zealots were looking for a Messiah like the other Jews were, but their emphasis was very clear. Their emphasis is what Peter's was in the beginning. They're going to have a wartime leader just like David. He's going to come in, he's going to overthrow the Romans, he's going to restore the kingdom to the Israelites and to the Jews. Long story short, they're patriots ready to die for their purpose. So they're given the title Sicarii. 2 weeks from now, I'm going to ask you this question. I'm going to go ahead and give you the question. Where have you heard the word Sicarii from? Well, you'll be able to say in 2 weeks. We heard it 2 weeks ago when you were talking about Simon the Zealot. I'm giving you the answer, so if you don't know in 2 weeks, shame on you. Sicarii and Iscariot are the same root. Iscariot is where Judas Iscariot's names come from. You're going to see a similarity in a couple of weeks that I'm going to ask you about these questions. Sicarii simply mean dagger men. It's actually pretty fascinating to read. What they would do, men, we tend to enjoy this more, learning about this stuff. What they would do is they had these curved daggers. They'd be about yay long, and they had a big curve in them. What they would do is they'd keep these daggers tucked down in their tunics. And their attack approach on people were, when they were coming up behind a Roman citizen, or even a Jew that was a friend of the Romans, they would walk up behind them, take out that dagger, stick them in the back, it'd go through their ribs, pierce their heart, and kill them immediately. Never even see them face to face. Right through their back, through their ribs. They had it down to an art. That's why they carried that curved dagger. That's what Sicarii means. They would burn Roman targets. They would destroy anything that had to do with Rome, and then they would return to Galilee and go back into hiding. It's actually even thought, believe it or not, that the Zealots had a major role in Rome's ultimate destruction of Jerusalem. That the Zealots would kill any Jew that wanted to compromise with the Romans until the Romans finally got fed up with it and they just destroyed all of Jerusalem, killing thousands and thousands of people. I tell you all of that and explain the Zealots for this reason. When I say Jesus calling Simon was surprising, that's an understatement. That would have floored people. You've got a guy full of passion. He's full of passion for God. They thought they were doing the right thing. They thought what they were doing was an honor to God. But they were just rebel murderers. They were extremists. What do you think Simon thought, for instance, when he heard what Paul said in Romans 13? That had to have blown his mind. You know that would have had to have blown his mind. Actually, I think I put it on here for you. How do you think somebody like that would respond to what Paul said to Romans? Let every soul, Romans 13:1, be subject to the governing authorities. Oh my goodness. For there is no authority except from God, and authorities that exist are appointed by God. Now this is a passage that one, I'm sure Simon had to take some getting used to, but this is a passage that I wish more people understood today. You know, I had a guy get mad at me a while back. Well, I guess it's been maybe a year now. I can't remember how long it was. I'm sure I'll hear an old man joke from somebody soon. I guess about a year ago, he got mad at me because I made this statement. A Christian should never say, "Let's go, Brandon." And he got mad about that. And I'm not going to elaborate on what "Let's go, Brandon" means. If you've been around, you know what that means. That's a jab at Joe Biden. Actually, it's a very vulgar jab at Joe Biden. And I told him, I said, a Christian should never say something like that. It certainly doesn't mesh with what Paul said in Romans. And again, I get it. I'm going to get off the political rant in just a moment. If a government is trying to enforce something that violates God's word, hey, fair enough, I'm right beside you. But just because we don't like somebody, there's no excuse to go around saying phrases like that are vulgar cusses towards somebody. Instead, what does the Bible say we should be doing for somebody like a Joe Biden that we may not agree with a lot of aspects of? Or maybe you're on the other side. What does the Bible say you should be doing with somebody like a Donald Trump that you may not have liked? Pray for them. Pray for the government that they turn to God. But I tell you that I don't know the last time we've had a truly godly person. All right, back to Simon. I'm going to get off that for a second, for a moment. I'm bad. My Bible study class will tell you I'm bad to get on little tangents like that. So it's enough. Simon saw enough and heard enough that even though he's a terrorist, extremist zealot, Jesus comes on the scene, calls Simon to be a follower. Simon is looking for the Messiah. So you think it's a match made in heaven, almost literally. But it's not the Messiah Simon is looking for. Yet Simon immediately, without any other talk about it, you don't get any detail, any descriptors, he just starts following Jesus, which means he lays down his zealot lifestyle altogether. And from that group, if you read about that group, that meant he was exiled from that group. He could have nothing to do with them ever again. So now notice the dynamics that Jesus just established. And you see if you can find what Jesus is trying to get them to understand. You just put Matthew, a former tax collector, friend of Rome, with Simon the Zealot, now hater of everything to do with Rome. You just put them two together. The natural mindset would say, uh-oh, that's not going to be good. That would be almost like putting me and Jason together watching the Alabama-Tennessee game. It's not going to fare well. No, I say that killing. We would have fun. We would probably enjoy it just because Alabama mostly wins. We would be okay. Simon would have killed Matthew. That's the dynamic Jesus just established. And he spends all night in prayer. God in flesh looked at Matthew. He looked at Simon, saw past what they've done to who they could be, and said, follow me. That's what Jesus saw. Wouldn't it have been poetic justice if when Jesus sent them out 2 by 2, he sent Matthew and Simon together? We don't know who they sent out, how he sent them out. We know he sent them out 2 by 2, and I just think that would have been, well, it probably would have been interesting, but it would have been pretty fascinating. I want you to understand something important about this. We're kind of getting towards the back half of this series. Next week we're going to look at, I don't want to say the most well-known apostle, the most hated apostle might be the better way to say it. We look at Judas. We don't have any information on Simon. This lesson is not about something Simon says. This lesson is not about something Simon wrote. It's not about a deed at all after his calling. There's none recorded. The lesson of Simon is passion and understanding God looking past the bad stuff. God looked past the bad stuff of Simon and saw his zealous heart. And that's all it took. Even if the zeal was in the wrong place. We don't know anything about Simon the Zealot after the day of Pentecost. We can look at Jewish tradition like we have been. It says that he went to the British Isles carrying the gospel, then on up into Persia, which would have taken a lot of faith to go into Persia. And in Persia, he was killed for preaching the gospel. That's according to Jewish history. We don't know. But you think about this. We know that he was persecuted and killed for his faith. So how much faith does it take for a person willing to kill someone that they didn't agree with to be willing to die to save someone they didn't know? Do you understand the poetic justice in that? That's a good cause worthy of a life spreading the gospel. So was Simon worthy of his call? Well, based on his past, we'd say no. What did Jesus see? Now here's my question. Because I always want to tie these back into us. Because I'm about to wrap up. What would it take to make you and me, you and I, worthy of the calling of Jesus Christ if it were us today? None of us, well, I don't think any of us here are zealots. Marshall, you're not a zealot, are you? Okay. To be honest, he was probably my most likely suspect, so I was going to at least ask. Justin's in the back, so I can't really ask him. I guess he might be number 2. The idea of being worthy is what's interesting to me. Listen, I want to read one more passage for you. I want you to hear what God said made Israel worthy of his call. And then I'm going to tie this back into us. I want you to hear what would make one worthy. Deuteronomy chapter 7. Beginning of verse 6. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the least of all peoples. But because the Lord loves you, and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers. The Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Therefore, know that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God who keeps covenants and mercy for 1,000 generations with those who love him and keep his commandments. And he repays those who hate him to their face to destroy them. He will not be slack with him who hates him. He will repay him face to face. So I love the way God puts this in the passage. What would make Israel worthy? God, and it says, God didn't choose Israel because you were the biggest and baddest. In fact, you were probably the smallest and weakest. God didn't choose Israel because they had the most, they were the least, that they weren't the smartest or the bravest. Verse 9 just told us what would make one worthy. Therefore, know that the Lord your God, He is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and mercy for 1,000 generations with those who love Him and keep His commandments. That night, Jesus spent in prayer before He called His apostles, before He called the rebel terrorists. I doubt it had to do with strength. I doubt it had to do with vigor that Simon had. Do you know what made Simon worthy of the call? Faith. Jesus calls based on your faith. We're not worthy. Do you think we deserve something like heaven? Do you think we deserve these things? We're not smart enough, strong enough, talented enough. Jesus sees faith. That's what He's looking for. If you have faith, He can work with everything else. The benchmark has always been faithfulness. So you look at the Simon the Zealots of the world, and you think there's no way, he's a crazy terrorist. Why would God call him when God saw him having faith and could forgive the rest? Simon never looks back. He follows Jesus the rest of his life. He lays his life down on that behalf. And I have to remind myself of this, and maybe you do as well. Simon's lesson gets a little more personal for us. Your calling as a Christian today is not predicated on what skill set you bring to the table. Because here's my question I'll leave up here. It's what do you bring to the table? Your calling as a Christian was never predicated on what you bring to the table. It doesn't matter if you can jump in the pulpit and speak. It doesn't matter if you can lead singing. I mean, look at Brother Parker. We'll let anybody do it. Just kidding. All Jesus requires is faith. That's all Jesus is looking for, an obedient faith. And if we have this, He'll take care of the rest. And so I love reading about the Matthews and the Simons, the people that we would overlook, that we would reject. And it reminds me that if we trust in Jesus, if we have our faith in Him, what do you think He could do with you if He can use Simon the Zealot? And I need that encouragement from time to time. I need that reminder. So what do you bring to the table? Do you bring strength, smarts, ability, agility, good public speaking? What do you bring to the table? Well, 9 times out of 10, people think they're not good enough to bring anything to the table. That's the point. It's never about what you bring to the table. It's about what the Lord put at the table for you. You just have to be faithful. That's all He's calling for. You have to be smart enough just to be a disciple of Jesus, to believe and understand who Jesus is. We couldn't bring enough to the table. All Jesus requires is faith. That's all He's looking for. So I want to encourage you all this afternoon. We're about to wrap up our afternoon service. So I want to encourage you this afternoon, don't be so worried about your shortcomings of faith. Don't be so worried about all the areas you don't excel where maybe somebody else excels. Or what you don't bring something to the table that you perceive that somebody else brings to the table. That's not what it's about. God will use whatever He's giving us to His glory through our faith. That's all He's looking for, our faith. And with that, there's no telling what God can do. You can look at Matthew and Simon to see that example. So if you're here this afternoon, if there's something in your faith that you're struggling with, if there's something that you think might be holding you back in your faith, learn the lesson from these men that we wouldn't have given a second look to, that most people in that day and age wouldn't have given a second look to. Learn what they teach you, that Jesus can work with your faith. So if you're in need this afternoon, I want to encourage you to come. Brady's going to come lead us in this invitation song. If we can help you in any way, don't miss this opportunity as we stand and we sing.